The words echoed in my mind as I sat in the dimly lit living room, gripping the edge of the sofa. What happens when boundaries blur and the weight of secrets threatens to shatter everything? Tonight, perfection unraveled, and I'm left questioning how far a single moment can push me from the life I thought I knew. Before we dive into this captivating story, don't forget to subscribe for more emotional tales that delve into love, betrayal, and human connections. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. The words echoed in my mind as I sat in the dimly lit living room, gripping the edge of the sofa. My heart pounded relentlessly, a cacophony of emotions swirling within me. How had things spiraled so far out of control? I stared at the family photo on the mantelpiece, a stark reminder of the life I was supposed to have. A perfect life. A loyal husband, a stepson I had promised to care for. But tonight, perfection had unraveled. It began innocuously enough, as most mistakes do. The day had started with a humdrum routine. My husband Greg had left early for work, muttering something about a late meeting. It wasn't unusual. His job as a financial consultant often kept him busy. Too busy for me, I thought bitterly as I poured coffee into a single mug. It had been weeks since we'd sat down together for more than a fleeting conversation. The cracks in our marriage, once hairline fractures, had widened into canyons. Then there was Ian, my stepson. He was 18, a senior in high school, and had recently moved back in with us after a fallout with his mother. Our relationship had always been cordial but distant, a mix of awkward politeness and unspoken boundaries, but over the past few months something had shifted. His glances lingered longer. His words carried a weight I couldn't quite place. At first I dismissed it as teenage awkwardness, but soon I couldn't deny the growing tension. That evening, it was just the two of us at home. Greg had texted, as expected, to say he'd be late. The silence in the house felt oppressive, and I decided to distract myself by reorganizing the living room. Ian wandered in, leaning casually against the doorway, his presence filling the space in a way that made me hyper-aware of my every movement. "Need help?" he asked, his voice deep and steady. I glanced at him, caught off guard by the sincerity in his tone. "Sure, if you're not busy." He moved to the coffee table, picking up a stack of magazines. We worked side by side, exchanging light banter. It felt normal, comfortable. But then, as I reached up to adjust a frame on the wall, I felt his eyes on me, intense and unyielding. When I turned to look at him, he didn't glance away. "You're really beautiful," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. My breath hitched. "Ian, I mean it," he continued, stepping closer. "I've always thought so." The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken emotions. I should have shut it down, said something to reestablish the boundaries that had begun to blur, but instead, I froze, caught in the web of his gaze. "You shouldn't say things like that," I managed to reply, my voice trembling. "Why not? It's true." Before I could respond, he reached for a fallen magazine on the floor, the movement breaking the spell. I exhaled shakily, retreating to the kitchen under the guise of needing a glass of water. My hands trembled as I gripped the counter, the coolness of the granite grounding me. What was happening? This was wrong. It had to stop. But it didn't. Later that evening, we found ourselves in the living room again, this time watching a movie. The room was dim, the flickering light from the television casting shadows on the walls. I tried to focus on the screen, but Ian's presence beside me was impossible to ignore. He sat close, too close. and when our hands brushed accidentally on the armrest, the electricity of the contact was undeniable. "I think you're lonely," he said softly, breaking the silence. I turned to him, startled. "What? You and Dad, you don't seem happy," he continued, his eyes searching mine. "You deserve more than that," I answered softly. My chest tightened. His words hit too close to home, exposing the fragile foundation of my marriage. But the way he looked at me, with such earnestness and intensity, made it hard to breathe. I wanted to push him away, to tell him he didn't understand. But I also wanted to stay in that moment, to feel seen and valued in a way I hadn't in years. We can't," I began, my voice faltering. He reached out, his hand brushing mine. "I just want to make you happy." Tears welled in my eyes, a storm of guilt and longing crashing over me. I should have walked away, but I stayed rooted to the spot, my resolve crumbling under the weight of his words. Then it happened, a movement so swift and unexpected that I barely had time to react. He shifted closer, his hands finding the waistband of my sweatpants. I gasped, a mixture of shock and an unnameable emotion coursing through me. "Ian, stop," I whispered, but my voice lacked conviction. "Tell me you don't want this," he said, his eyes locking onto mine, daring me to deny the truth. But I couldn't, or maybe I wouldn't. The lines between right and wrong had blurred beyond recognition, and in that moment, I didn't have the strength to redraw them. I bolted upright, pulling myself away from the swirling vortex of emotions threatening to pull me under. The air between us was electric, charged with a tension that felt both intoxicating and suffocating. Ian sat frozen, his hand hovering mid-air, as if waiting for permission to cross an invisible line. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, a frantic rhythm that drowned out the soft hum of the television. "Ian," I said, my voice cracking, "this has to stop." He blinked, a flicker of regret flashing across his face. "I'm sorry," he murmured, pulling back. I don't know what I'm doing," he replied. Silence and pain. Neither did I. The storm inside me was relentless, torn between the undeniable connection we had in that moment and the stark reality of the consequences. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling as I moved toward the doorway. "I need some air," I said over my shoulder, hoping the distance would clear my mind. Outside, the crisp night air wrapped around me like a cold embrace, shocking me back to my senses. The stars above twinkled with an indifference that only deepened my shame. What was I doing? How had I let things get so far? As I processed the impact of what had just happened, but the truth was undeniable. Ian's words had struck a chord, one I'd been ignoring for too long. I was lonely, desperately so. My marriage, once a sanctuary, had become a prison of unspoken grievances and emotional neglect. Greg and I existed in the same space, but we were miles apart, two strangers going through the motions of a life we no longer shared. "I thought I might find you out here." Ian's voice startled me, breaking through my spiraling thoughts. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked younger in the moonlight, vulnerable in a way that tugged at something deep within me. "Ian," I began, my tone sharp with the intention of setting boundaries. "This isn't—" "I know," he interrupted, stepping closer. "I know it's wrong, but I can't help how I feel. and I don't think you can either. Instead, his words hung in the air between us, heavy with truth and temptation. I opened my mouth to protest, to deny the feelings he so plainly articulated, but the words refused to come, because deep down, I knew he was right. There was a part of me, small, shameful, and hidden, that didn't want him to stop. "You're young," I said finally, grasping for logic. "You don't understand what you're doing." Phaedrus let out a long breath. He laughed softly, a sound devoid of humor. "I'm not a kid, and you know it. Stop pretending this is one-sided." The conviction in his voice rattled me, shaking loose the carefully constructed walls I'd built to contain my emotions. I turned away, staring out into the darkness, hoping it would swallow me whole. But Ian was relentless, stepping closer until I could feel the heat of his body behind me. "You're not happy, are you?" he asked, his voice low and probing. "With him, I mean." I closed my eyes, the truth seeping into the cracks of my resolve. "It doesn't matter," I whispered. "He's my husband, and you're his son, and—" "Stepson," he corrected, the words sharp and deliberate. "It's not the same, and you know it." The technicality felt hollow, a desperate grasp at justification. But his presence was overwhelming, his words a siren's song, pulling me deeper into dangerous waters. I turned to face him, my resolve crumbling under the weight of his gaze. "This has to stop," I said again, but my voice lacked the conviction it needed. "Then stop me," he challenged, his tone both daring and pleading. "Tell me to leave, and I will." I opened my mouth to tell him exactly that, to demand he step back and give me the space I so desperately needed. But no sound came. Instead, we stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills, the tension between us crackling like a live wire. He stepped closer, closing the distance between us until there was barely an inch between our bodies. I could feel his breath on my skin, warm and steady, a stark contrast to the chaos inside me. My heart raced, each beat a painful reminder of the line I was about to cross. "Ian," I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of unspoken desires. He raised a hand, his fingers brushing against my cheek with a tenderness that made my chest ache. "You don't have to be alone," he said softly. "Not anymore." Tears welled in my eyes, blurring the edges of the world around me. I wanted to believe him, to let myself be swept away by the promise of something new, something real. But the reality of our situation loomed like a storm cloud, a reminder of everything we stood to lose. And how— "I can't," I said finally, stepping back. "I won't." His expression faltered, a mix of hurt and understanding flickering across his face. "I get it," he said, his voice barely audible. "But you can't keep pretending everything's okay. Not with him, not with yourself." The truth of his words hit me like a freight train, shattering the fragile denial I'd been clinging to. I turned away, unable to meet his gaze, and he took the hint, retreating back into the house without another word. I stayed outside for what felt like hours, the cold seeping into my bones as I wrestled with the weight of my choices. By the time I finally returned to the house, the lights were off, and the silence was deafening. Ian's door was closed, a barrier I couldn't bring myself to breach. Lying in bed that night, I stared at the ceiling, the events of the evening playing on a loop in my mind. I wanted to believe I'd made the right choice, that I'd put an end to something that never should have begun. But the ache in my chest told a different story, one of longing and regret that refused to be silenced. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the curtains, I knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same. The morning came too quickly. Sunlight spilled through the window, illuminating the room in soft, golden hues, but it brought no comfort. I had barely slept, my mind looping through every word, every glance, and every unspoken emotion from the night before. The weight of it pressed on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I dragged myself out of bed and into the kitchen, hoping the mundane act of making coffee would steady my nerves. Ian was already there. He stood at the counter, his back to me, pouring water into the coffee maker. The sight of him, so casual and unassuming, sent a fresh wave of tension through me. I hesitated in the doorway, debating whether to retreat and avoid him altogether. But he turned before I could make my escape. "Morning," he said, his voice neutral, but his eyes searching mine. "Morning," I replied, my tone clipped as I moved to the fridge, busying myself with finding something to eat. The silence that followed was suffocating, every second stretching unbearably long. I could feel his presence behind me, the unspoken tension from the night before lingering like a storm cloud. "I shouldn't have said those things," he said finally, breaking the silence, "or done what I did." I turned to face him, startled by his bluntness. His expression was earnest, his brows furrowed in what I could only interpret as regret. For a moment, I wanted to believe that his apology could undo everything, that we could go back to the way things were before. "It's in the past," I said, forcing a calmness I didn't feel. "Let's just move on." He nodded, though his eyes told a different story. "Right. Move on." The words hung in the air, empty promises neither of us truly believed. I poured myself a cup of coffee, avoiding his gaze, and sat at the kitchen table. He joined me a moment later, the chair scraping loudly against the floor as he pulled it out. "Is Dad coming home late again?" he asked, his tone casual, as if he were trying to ease the tension with small talk. I nodded. "Probably. He mentioned something about a client dinner." Ian scoffed softly, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Sounds about right?" he asked. I glanced at him, catching the edge in his tone. There it was again, that undercurrent of resentment he seemed to carry toward his father. I had noticed it before, in the way he avoided Greg's calls or dismissed his attempts at conversation, but I had never pried. It wasn't my place. "You know, he's trying," I said, surprising myself with the need to defend Greg. Ian laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Sure, he's trying. Just not with you." His words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I looked away, focusing on the swirling steam rising from my coffee. "That's enough, Ian," I said quietly. "Sorry," he muttered, but there was no conviction in his voice. The day passed in a blur of chores and distractions. I scrubbed the counters, vacuumed the floors, and reorganized the pantry, anything to keep my hands busy and my mind from wandering. Ian stayed out of my way, retreating to his room for most of the afternoon. By the time evening rolled around, I was emotionally spent. Greg texted to say he wouldn't be home until late, and for the first time, I felt relief rather than disappointment. His absence meant I didn't have to put on a brave face, didn't have to pretend that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Outside, the heat spiked, and I closed my eyes. As the hours stretched on, the house grew quieter, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I settled on the couch with a glass of wine, hoping it would help me unwind. But my thoughts kept circling back to Ian, to the intensity in his eyes and the things he had said. I didn't hear him approach. "You're drinking alone?" His voice startled me, and I looked up to see him standing in the doorway, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. "Just one glass," I replied, lifting it slightly as if to prove my point. He stepped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate, and sat down on the armchair across from me. The distance between us felt intentional, a silent acknowledgement of the boundaries we were both struggling to maintain. "I've been thinking," he began, his tone measured, "about what you said, about moving on." I raised an eyebrow, unsure of where he was going with this. "Okay, I'm trying," he said, his gaze fixed on the floor. "But it's hard, being here, seeing you every day." "I know," just my stomach clenched. "Ian, we can't keep having this conversation." "I know," he said quickly, looking up at me. I need to say this. Then I'll drop it, I swear." He closed. I nodded reluctantly, bracing myself for whatever he was about to say. "I've never felt like this before," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not with anyone. And I know it's wrong, but I can't help it. You make me feel seen. Like I'm not just some kid trying to figure out my life." His words hit me like a tidal wave, pulling me under. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he was confusing admiration with something deeper, but the sincerity in his voice made it hard to dismiss. He wasn't just a teenager with a crush. He was a young man grappling with emotions he didn't know how to handle, and I was the unwitting target of his affection. "Ian," I began, my voice shaking, "this isn't fair. To me, to you, we can't—" "I know," he interrupted, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I just needed you to know." The vulnerability in his expression was heartbreaking, and for a moment, I felt an overwhelming urge to comfort him, but I stayed rooted to the couch, gripping my wine glass as if it were a lifeline. "You're going to meet someone," I said gently, "someone your own age, who can give you what you're looking for. And when you do, this, whatever this is, it'll seem like a distant memory." He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe, but I don't want someone else. I want you." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. He stood then, giving me a long, searching look before retreating to his room. I sat there in stunned silence, the weight of his confession pressing down on me like a stone. I wanted to believe that this was the end, that his words were a way of finding closure. But deep down, I knew better. Some lines, once crossed, could never be erased. The next morning brought an unbearable quiet to the house. The air felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. I avoided Ian entirely, retreating to the sanctuary of my bedroom under the pretense of being busy with work, but no amount of distractions could erase the weight of his words from the night before. "I want you." The phrase echoed in my mind, weaving itself into every thought and leaving me breathless with guilt and confusion. I had tried to convince myself that he was just young and infatuated, that his feelings would pass if I maintained enough distance. But there was something about the way he looked at me, the sincerity in his voice, that made me question everything I thought I knew. By midday, I finally ventured out of my room, needing a reprieve from my thoughts. The kitchen was empty, the house eerily still, A note on the counter caught my attention. Went for a run, be back later. Ian. I let out a sigh of relief, grateful for the reprieve. The silence of the house was a small mercy, giving me time to collect myself. I poured a cup of coffee and sat at the table, letting the warmth of the mug soothe my trembling hands. But peace didn't last long. The front door opened and Ian stepped inside, his hair damp with sweat and his shirt clinging to his chest. He paused when he saw me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the tension between us as palpable as ever. "You're up early," he said, breaking the silence. I shrugged, trying to appear casual. "Couldn't sleep." He nodded, his gaze lingering on me for a moment too long before he headed toward the stairs. I thought he was going to retreat to his room, but he paused at the base of the staircase, his hand resting on the railing. "Are we okay?" he asked, his voice hesitant. I blinked, caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" He turned to face me fully, his expression earnest. "After last night, I don't want things to be weird between us." I let out a shaky laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Ian, things are already weird." His lips quirked into a small smile, but it quickly faded. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you," he said softly. I needed you to know how I feel." "And now I do," I replied, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. "But that doesn't change the fact that it's not something we can act on." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but it doesn't make it any easier." He lingered for a moment longer before retreating up the stairs, leaving me alone with my thoughts once again. I stared into my coffee, the swirling liquid mirroring the chaos in my mind. No matter how hard I tried to push him away, the lines between us continued to blur, each interaction pulling us deeper into uncharted territory. That evening, Greg came home earlier than expected, his presence a jarring reminder of the life I was supposed to be living. He kissed my cheek absent-mindedly as he set down his briefcase, his eyes already glued to his phone. "How was your day?" he asked, his tone distracted. "Fine," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Yours?" He muttered something about work and deadlines, his attention already drifting elsewhere. It was the same routine we had fallen into over the years, a series of half-hearted exchanges that barely scratched the surface of our lives. I watched him settle into his usual spot on the couch, scrolling through emails as if I weren't even there. For the first time, the weight of his indifference felt unbearable. Later that night, as I lay in bed beside him, I found myself wide awake, staring at the ceiling. His steady breathing filled the room, a stark contrast to the turmoil in my chest. I thought about Ian, about the way he had looked at me with such raw vulnerability, and a pang of guilt twisted in my stomach. How had I let things get so far? Unable to stand the confines of the room any longer, I slipped out of bed and padded quietly down the hallway. The house was dark, the only sound the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I wasn't sure where I was going, but my steps carried me to the door of Ian's room. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. What was I doing? This was madness. I should turn around, go back to bed, and pretend this night had never happened. But some invisible force compelled me forward, and before I could stop myself, I knocked softly. The door opened almost immediately, as if he had been waiting. Ian stood in the doorway, his hair tousled and his eyes heavy with sleep. He blinked at me, confusion flickering across his face. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, though the words felt like a lie. "I couldn't sleep." He stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. I hesitated for only a moment before crossing the threshold, the door clicking softly shut behind me. The room was dimly lit by the glow of his bedside lamp, casting long shadows on the walls. I perched on the edge of his bed, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ian," I began, my voice trembling. "We need to talk." He sat down beside me, his proximity making it hard to think. "I know what you're going to say," he said quietly. "And I get it. I do." I looked at him, my resolve wavering under the intensity of his gaze. "You're young," I said, the words feeling hollow even as I spoke them. "This isn't real. It's just—" "Don't do that," he interrupted, his tone firm. "Don't dismiss what I'm feeling like it doesn't matter." He looked into my eyes, his gaze lighting up, but the question in his voice stung. "It matters," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But that doesn't make it right." We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of our unspoken emotions pressing down on us. Finally, I stood, forcing myself to create the distance I so desperately needed. Yes, I could do this. It was time. We both needed it. "This has to stop," I said, my tone firm, "for both our sakes." He nodded slowly, though his eyes betrayed his reluctance. "If that's what you want." "It is," I said, though the words felt like a betrayal. I left the room without looking back, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I climbed back into bed, I knew I had done the right thing. But the ache in my chest told a different story. The days that followed were a haze of forced normalcy. I threw myself into the routine of life: work, chores, errands, desperately trying to distract myself from the growing weight in my chest. Ian seemed to be doing the same. He avoided me as much as possible, retreating to his room or leaving the house for hours on end. When we did cross paths, the air between us was thick with unspoken tension. Greg, as usual, was oblivious to it all. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, Greg droned on about a new client at work. His voice faded into the background as my thoughts drifted to Ian. He was seated across from me, his eyes focused on his plate, his movements stiff and mechanical. He hadn't said a word since we sat down, and I couldn't help but notice the shadows under his eyes, the tension in his jaw. "Are you feeling okay, Ian?" I asked, breaking the silence. Greg glanced up from his plate, as if realizing for the first time that his son was even at the table. Ian looked at me, his expression unreadable. "I'm fine," he said curtly, stabbing a piece of chicken with his fork. "You don't look fine," I pressed, my concern overriding my better judgment. He let out a sharp laugh, the sound bitter and laced with frustration. "I said I'm fine." Gray frowned, his gaze darting between us. "Is there something going on I should know about?" My stomach dropped. "Of course not," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "He's just been studying a lot. It's probably stress." Then, his eyes fixed on mine. Ian's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his focus returning to his plate. Greg seemed satisfied with the explanation, returning to his monologue about work. I picked at my food, the tension in the room suffocating. Ian didn't say another word for the rest of the meal, and as soon as it was over, he excused himself and disappeared upstairs. I lingered in the kitchen after Greg went to his office, staring at the sink full of dishes but making no move to wash them. My thoughts were a tangled mess, guilt and longing intertwining in a way that made it impossible to think clearly. I told myself I was doing the right thing, maintaining the boundaries that had already been tested too many times. But the look in Ian's eyes at dinner haunted me, a silent accusation I couldn't shake. Later that night, I found myself standing outside Ian's door once again. I didn't know what I hoped to accomplish, but the weight in my chest had become unbearable. I raised my hand to knock, but before I could, the door opened, and Ian stood there, his expression a mixture of surprise and something else, something I couldn't quite place. "Hey," he said, his voice soft. "Hey," I replied, my pulse quickening. "Can we talk?" He stepped aside, letting me in. The room was dimly lit, the glow of his desk lamp casting a warm light over the space. I sat on the edge of his bed, feeling more vulnerable than I had in years. "I'm worried about you," I said, breaking the silence. He sat down in the chair by his desk, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "You don't need to be, Ian. I know this hasn't been easy for either of us," I continued, choosing my words carefully. "But we need to figure out how to move forward. I don't want things to be like this." "Like what?" he asked, his tone guarded. "Distant," I said. "Awkward. You mean a lot to me, Ian, and I hate that we've let things get so complicated." "Everything okay?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're acting like this is something we can just brush under the rug like it didn't happen." "I'm not saying that," I said quickly, "but we can't keep living in this limbo. It's not healthy for either of us." He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine. "Do you regret it?" he asked finally. The question caught me off guard and I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Did I regret the tension, the blurred lines, the emotional turmoil? Yes. But did I regret the connection we had shared, however fleeting? The answer was more complicated. "I don't regret caring about you," I said carefully, "but I regret letting things go too far." His jaw tightened and he looked away, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I'm sorry," he said after a moment, "for putting you in this position." "Ah?" she asked. "I'm sorry too," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with words we couldn't say and emotions we couldn't name. Finally, Ian stood, crossing the room to sit beside me on the bed. The closeness was both comforting and terrifying, a reminder of everything we were trying to avoid. "I don't know how to stop feeling this way," he admitted, his voice raw, "but I'll try. For you." His words broke something inside me, a mix of relief and sadness washing over me in equal measure. I placed a hand on his shoulder, the gesture meant to comfort, but the contact sent a jolt through me that I tried desperately to ignore. He leaned his head back and blinked down at me. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. We sat there for a moment longer, the unspoken agreement between us hanging in the air. It wasn't a resolution, not really, but it was a step in the right direction. Or at least that's what I told myself as I left his room and closed the door behind me. The next morning, Ian was gone before I woke up, leaving a note on the kitchen counter. "Gone to clear my head. Don't worry about me. Ian." I stared at the note, a pang of anxiety settling in my chest. I didn't know where he had gone or how long he planned to be away, but I hoped the space would give him the clarity he needed. It was what I needed, too. Greg noticed Ian's absence but didn't seem overly concerned. "He's a teenager," he said with a shrug. "He'll come back when he's hungry." I forced a laugh, but the truth was, I wasn't sure. Ian's feelings had been intense, consuming, and I didn't know if time and distance would be enough to dull their edge. All I could do was wait and hope. As the days turned into weeks, Ian's absence left a void in the house that was impossible to ignore. I busied myself with work and tried to repair the cracks in my marriage. But the weight of everything lingered, a constant reminder of the lines we had crossed and the consequences that came with them. "Hey, sport," Greg said, clapping Ian on the shoulder. "Everything good here while I was gone?" Ian nodded. "Yeah, no problems." Greg smiled, oblivious to the currents beneath the surface. "Glad to hear it. Maybe we can all have dinner together tonight? It's been a while since we've had a proper family meal." I forced another smile, nodding in agreement. "That sounds nice." Hazel eyes me mine. "Everyone okay?" Greg asked suddenly, his brow furrowing as he looked between the two of us. "You're both awfully quiet." "Just tired," I said quickly, offering a small smile. "It's been a long week." Ian nodded in agreement, his gaze fixed on his plate. Greg seemed to accept the explanation, though a flicker of doubt remained in his eyes. He shrugged it off, returning to his story about a particularly obnoxious coworker, but the tension lingered. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "Me neither," he admitted, stepping aside to let me in. I hesitated for only a moment before crossing the threshold, the door clicking softly shut behind me. The room was dimly lit, the glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. He sat on the edge of his bed, his posture tense, and I perched on the chair by his desk, keeping a careful distance. "Is everything okay?" I asked, though the question felt inadequate. He nodded, though his expression told a different story. "I've been thinking a lot," he said after a moment, his voice hesitant. "About everything." "So have I said, my heart pounding. "I know this has been hard on you," he continued, his gaze fixed on the floor. "And I don't want to make it harder. That's why I think maybe it's time for me to go." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Go? What do you mean?" He looked up then, his eyes filled with a mixture of resolve and sadness. "I think I need to move out, get my own place. I'm old enough, and I think it's for the best." My chest tightened, panic rising like a tide. "Ian, you don't have to do that. We can figure this out." He shook his head. "No, we can't. Not while we're under the same roof. It's not fair to you or to Dad." The house felt emptier without him, the absence of his presence like a missing piece of a puzzle. Greg seemed unaffected, chalking it up to Ian wanting his independence. I didn't correct him. The truth was a burden I would carry alone. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into repairing my marriage, determined to salvage what I could. Greg and I started spending more time together, rekindling the connection we had lost, and for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. But late at night, when the house was quiet and Greg was asleep beside me, I found myself thinking of Ian, wondering where he was, how he was doing, if he missed me as much as I missed him. The ache in my chest never fully went away, a constant reminder of the lines we had crossed and the consequences that had followed. In the end, I told myself it was for the best. Ian deserved a chance to move on, to find happiness free of the shadows of the past. And so did I. But some scars never truly heal. I never imagined my life could spiral so far out of control. I was supposed to have it all: a loyal husband, a picture-perfect family, and a life most would envy. But lately the cracks in my marriage have grown too wide to ignore. Greg, my husband, is always busy, distant, and oblivious to the void growing between us. And then there's Ian, my stepson. As soon as what started as fleeting glances and casual conversations shifted into something I couldn't quite explain. A tension I knew I should never entertain. Sorry. One evening, when it was just Ian and me at home, things escalated. A single compliment, a lingering touch, it all blurred the boundaries we were supposed to uphold. My guilt screamed at me to stop, but my heart whispered otherwise. Now, I'm caught in a web of emotions and forbidden desires, unsure of how to navigate this dangerous path without losing everything I've built. Starting to feel like a failure, I say nothing. Finally, I hear,